whispers of forgotten empires, echoes of lost gods, and truths buried in time. Welcome to Ancient Luminaries, where the ancient world comes alive.
An idea can look harmless right up until it threatens someone's throne. William of Ockham is often reduced to a modern slogan. The simplest explanation is usually best. But in the 1300s, that kind of intellectual cutting didn't stay inside classrooms. It sliced into the church's grand systems, into the legal language of authority, and into the claims powerful men used to rule. And once you start asking, do we really need all these extra layers to explain what we believe? You're not just doing philosophy anymore. You're stepping into a world where a sentence can trigger an investigation and a method can make you an enemy. In the Middle Ages, people didn't treat ideas like harmless decorations. An idea could change a law. An idea could change a king's loyalty. An idea could change what a whole nation thought God required. And sometimes, an idea could put a man on trial. That is the world William of Ockham lived in. Most people meet him through a single modern phrase, Occam's razor. The simplest explanation is often the best. Don't pile on extra assumptions if you don't need them. It sounds obvious now, but in Occam's century, it wasn't just a clever rule for debates. It was a way of cutting into the huge intellectual machine that medieval Europe had built to explain reality. If you enjoy history that follows a mind through real danger and real consequences, take a moment to subscribe and stay with us. The next stories will take you to other thinkers and rulers who changed the world without ever swinging a sword. Now, let's go back to England. Before Occam was famous, before he was condemned, before he became an exile with an emperor's protection, William was born around the late 1280 in a village whose name became his identity, Ockham. That's why we call him William of Ockham. In his world, family surnames didn't function the way they do today. Place was a name, origin was a label. It told people where you belonged, and in a time of local loyalties, belonging mattered. He entered the Franciscan order. That single decision shaped everything that followed. The Franciscans were a religious movement built around a striking claim. The most authentic way to follow Christ was to embrace poverty. Not modest living, but poverty as a spiritual discipline. They were mendicants, meaning they often lived by begging. They traveled, they preached, they tried to imitate what they believed was the life of Jesus and the apostles. This was beautiful to many ordinary people. It also made powerful people nervous. Because once you make poverty the sign of holiness, you create a question that never goes away. If poverty is holy, what does that say about the wealth of bishops? What does that say about palaces, jewels, and taxes? What does that say about a church that owns vast land and negotiates like a kingdom? So from the start, the Franciscan movement lived close to a political fault line, even when its members wanted only spiritual devotion. Ockham also lived close to another fault line, the intellectual world of scholasticism. Picture a medieval university. It isn't a quiet campus with casual seminars. It is a training ground for the church's brain. Students debate in Latin. Teachers argue with a precision that feels like law. They take questions that sound abstract and treat them like matters of life and death, because in a way they were. What is knowledge? What is truth? What can reason prove? What belongs to faith? What can we say about God without making God smaller than God? By Ockham's time, European scholars had inherited a powerful toolbox from Aristotle. Aristotle offered categories and logical structures that could make knowledge feel systematic. If theology could be expressed in a rational system, then theology could look like the highest science of all. That was the dream. But there was a cost. When you build a system, you start to protect the system. You start to treat the system's pieces as necessary, even if the pieces are not clearly grounded in scripture or experience. You start adding invisible entities, invisible structures, invisible natures and forms, because they make the system run smoothly. Ockham noticed that habit, and he distrusted it. He was trained in logic, and he respected reasoning, but he also believed that reasoning had limits, especially when people tried to use it to construct a detailed map of God and the universe that went far beyond what could be supported. His most famous intellectual battles centered on a question that sounds harmless until you realize how much hangs on it. Do universals exist? A universal is a general concept like humanity, redness, or justice. When you see two different people, you call both human. When you see two different apples, you call both red. The question is whether humanity and redness are real things that exist in the world. or whether they are simply names we give to groups of similar things. Some medieval thinkers argued that universals were real in a deep way. They might exist in the mind of God. They might exist as forms inside things. They might exist in a realm of meanings. However you described it, universals were not just words. They were part of reality's structure. Ockham pushed back. He argued that only individual things exist in the world. This human, that apple, this tree, that stone. The universal is not a separate entity floating above them. The universal is a concept in our mind, a way our language groups similar individuals. He wasn't denying that people share similarities. He was denying that we must add extra invisible things to explain those similarities. If we can explain our knowledge and language by referring to individuals and how we think about them, then we should not multiply entities beyond necessity. That is the razor. The razor is not a command to worship simplicity for its own sake. It is a discipline of caution. It says, don't invent extra layers of reality just to make your theory elegant. Don't build a palace of metaphysics if a sturdy house of explanation will do. This move had enormous consequences. If universals are not real entities, then much of the heavy scholastic machinery becomes less necessary. The complex talk about essences and forms can start to look like an elaborate language game. And if that machinery weakens, then the relationship between reason and theology shifts. Ockham's approach tends to emphasize God's freedom and the limits of human reason. God is not trapped inside our logical categories. God does not need our metaphysical scaffolding. That sounds like reverence. But it also threatens systems built on the claim that reason can map theology with deep certainty. Some scholars saw Ockham as cutting away the foundation. Yet Ockham did not see himself as destroying theology. He saw himself as protecting it from overconfidence. He believed we should be careful about what we claim to know. We should not pretend to deduce detailed truths about God's inner life from philosophical assumptions. Where revelation speaks, we listen. Where reason can argue clearly, we argue. But where we are tempted to fill in the gaps with speculative entities, we resist. This is why Ockham is sometimes called a nominalist, because he emphasized names nomina rather than real universals. But even that label can mislead. Ockham was not a modern skeptic mocking belief. He was a medieval Christian trying to keep theology grounded and to keep reason honest about its limits. While these intellectual debates unfolded, another conflict was growing around him that would turn his life upside down. The papacy had moved to Avignon. Instead of Rome, the popes lived in southern France, under heavy French influence. The papal court in Avignon was wealthy, administrative, and intensely political. It looked like a royal government. It negotiated with kings, it managed taxes, it issued legal decisions that affected all of Europe. And in that environment, the Franciscan ideal of poverty became explosive. Within the Franciscan order, there were debates about what poverty meant in practice. Could the order own property in a legal sense if it was used by friars? Could property be owned by the papacy on behalf of the Franciscans? Could the Franciscans accept certain resources for stability without betraying their founding spirit? Some Franciscans insisted on the strictest reading. Christ and the apostles owned nothing. True Christian perfection required absolute poverty. This view made the Franciscan movement feel like a living mirror held up to the church's wealth. Pope John XXII challenged that interpretation. He argued in ways that effectively weakened the claim that Christ and the apostles owned nothing. The debate was technical, legal, and theological, but the stakes were direct. If the Pope could redefine the poverty ideal, then the papacy protected itself from a powerful moral accusation. Ockham was drawn into this conflict. By 1324, he was summoned to Avignon. Imagine the scene. A Franciscan scholar arrives in a papal court where suspicion is thick. He knows he is being examined. He knows that the difference between error and heresy can be decided by the people questioning him. He knows that even if his arguments are careful, they might still threaten powerful interests. At Avignon, Ockham studied the papal statements on poverty and became convinced that the Pope was wrong, not merely as a policy choice, but as a matter of doctrine and truth. That is a dangerous conviction to hold inside the papal court. Around him, other Franciscan leaders were reaching similar conclusions. The conflict was no longer an internal debate inside the order. It became a confrontation between a Franciscan interpretation of Christ's poverty and the Pope's authority to define doctrine in a way that protected papal governance. At this point, the story becomes more than philosophy. It becomes a contest over who holds ultimate authority in the church. Does the Pope have the right to declare a theological position true simply because he is Pope? Or can the Pope be wrong in a way that obligates believers to resist him? Ockham's later writings will answer this with startling force. But even now, in Avignon, the direction is clear. Ockham is not just an academic. He is becoming an opponent of papal absolutism. And then, in 1328, he makes a choice that ends any hope of a quiet life. He flees. He leaves Avignon with key Franciscan figures, and they seek protection under the Holy Roman Emperor, Louis IV of Bavaria. This was not an escape to some neutral sanctuary. It was a move straight into the center of another major power struggle. Louis IV was already in conflict with the papacy over imperial authority. By supporting Louis, Ockham and the Franciscans were effectively choosing a political side against the Pope. From the papacy's perspective, this looked like rebellion. From Ockham's perspective, it looked like conscience. He would later be excommunicated. He would spend years writing not only about logic and language, but about the limits of papal power. He would help shape arguments that echoed into later debates about church and state. But before we get there, we need to pause and feel the weight of this moment. A friar who began as a scholar of universals and language has crossed into open conflict with the highest authority of Western Christianity. He has placed himself under the protection of an emperor who is also fighting the Pope. He has stepped out of the classroom and into history's harshest arena. And now the question becomes unavoidable. What does a philosopher do when his ideas collide with power? In Ockham's case, he does what he always did. He cuts away what he thinks is unnecessary, and he targets the claim at its root. And that is where his most dangerous work begins. When Ockham arrived under imperial protection, he did not find peace. He found a new battlefield, one made of letters, legal claims, and competing visions of authority. The Holy Roman Empire in this period was not a neat centralized state. It was a complex network of territories, princes, bishops, and cities, all tied together by a symbolic imperial crown and constant negotiation. The emperor's authority depended on recognition, alliances, and the ability to act decisively when challenged. And one of the emperor's biggest challenges was the Pope. For centuries, European rulers had wrestled with a question that never stayed settled for long. Who stands higher in the order of authority, the spiritual head of the church or the political head of the empire? When Pope and emperor agree, the question stays quiet. When they clash, the question becomes the question. Louis IV of Bavaria and Pope John were clashing. Louis claimed the imperial title and authority in ways that the Pope resisted. The Pope, in turn, asserted the right to judge the legitimacy of the emperor. This wasn't just pride, it was power. If the Pope could declare an emperor illegitimate, he could weaken that emperor's alliances, invite rebellion, and strengthen rivals. So when Ockham fled Avignon and moved into Louis's orbit, he stepped into the core of medieval power struggle. His arguments about Franciscan poverty now blended with arguments about papal limits. The same mind that refused to multiply entities beyond necessity began refusing to grant the Pope powers beyond necessity. Ockham's political writing is less famous among casual audiences than his razor, but it may be the more historically explosive part of his legacy. Because here he attacks a claim that had been growing for centuries. The idea that the Pope possesses near absolute authority over the Church, and in some interpretations, even over temporal rulers. Ockham did not deny that the Pope had authority. He denied that the Pope's authority was unlimited, and he denied that papal authority could override truth. In simple terms, he argued something like this: the Pope is meant to serve the faith, not redefine it at will. The Pope is meant to protect the Church, not become its master in the sense of owning it. The Pope can err, and if the Pope errs in a serious way, the faithful are not obligated to follow him into error. That idea sounds almost natural to modern ears, but in the 14th century it was dynamite. It threatened a growing model of papal monarchy, where the Pope functioned like a sovereign whose judgments were final. Ockham's reasoning draws on a medieval logic of office. A role is defined by its purpose. If a role exists for the sake of the Church's faith, then the holder of that role cannot legitimately use it to undermine faith. Authority is therefore not simply power. It is responsibility bound by the ends for which it exists. He also argued that Scripture and the core teachings of Christianity stand above any single office holder. If a pope contradicts scripture or contradicts the essential tradition of the church, then the pope is the one who is out of order. This is one reason Ockham's name appears in later discussions about conciliar ideas, the thought that church councils can have authority that checks the pope. Ockham did not create later conciliar movements by himself, but his arguments contributed to the intellectual environment that made such movements possible. And he was writing under pressure. These weren't academic exercises. These were survival arguments for an exile community. If Ockham and the Franciscans were being condemned, they needed a coherent account of why the condemning authority could be wrong. In this period, Ockham wrote works with titles that reflect the intensity of the moment. Some of his writings are framed like dialogues and legal disputations. He examines claims, counters them, asks what follows if this claim is accepted, and then trims away what he sees as illegitimate extensions of power. The tone is often relentless. It can feel like a man pushing a blade into a knot of assumptions, cutting until the knot loosens. This is the same intellectual temperament behind the razor. The razor is not only a rule of explanation, it is a habit of distrust toward unnecessary additions. In metaphysics, it cuts away needless universals. In politics, it cuts away needless claims of supremacy. But there is a deeper philosophical foundation beneath the razor, and it's worth pausing here because it helps you understand why Ockham's name became so influential in later centuries. Ockham's philosophy emphasizes the primacy of individuals and the limits of what we can claim to know about invisible structures. When a thinker believes that our knowledge should be grounded in what is directly evident either in experience or in revelation, he becomes cautious about making large speculative claims. This caution becomes a kind of intellectual humility, but it also becomes a kind of intellectual liberation. If you don't need to accept an elaborate metaphysical hierarchy to do theology, then theology becomes less dependent on one philosophical system. It becomes more flexible. It becomes, in a sense, more portable. That portability matters in history. Later thinkers, including early modern scientists, often benefited from the weakening of heavy metaphysical frameworks. They could focus more on observation and simpler causal explanations without feeling obligated to defend a huge tower of scholastic categories first. This does not mean Ockham invented modern science. It means his style of intellectual pruning fit well with later habits of thought. He made it respectable, within a Christian intellectual world, to say, we should not claim more than we can support. Now, many people misunderstand Ockham's razor. They treat it as, the simplest explanation is always true. That is not what the razor says. The razor is a guide, not a guarantee. Sometimes the simplest explanation is false. Reality can be complex. The razor is about not adding extra assumptions when you don't need them. It is about economy, not about certainty. Ockham himself would probably be cautious about turning the razor into a universal law, because he was keenly aware that human knowledge has limits. The razor is a method of discipline, not a magical shortcut. And there is another misunderstanding. Some people treat Ockham like a skeptic who tore down medieval belief. But Ockham did not reject Christianity. He defended core Christian doctrine. He was willing to say that some truths are known by revelation, not by philosophical proof. That move can sound like surrender of reason, but for Ockham, it was a boundary marker. Reason is powerful, but it is not God. Do not pretend that human logic can climb all the way into divine mystery. This boundary also shaped his view of God's power. Ockham emphasized divine freedom. God is not constrained by our categories. God can act beyond what we would predict from natural patterns. That emphasis, again, is not a modern scientific stance. It is a theological stance that protects God's sovereignty. At the same time, Ockham also thought human beings should be careful and honest about how they describe the world. He wanted language to be clear. He wanted logic to be precise. He wanted arguments to avoid unnecessary metaphysical baggage. That combination, precision plus humility, made him both admired and feared. Now, while Ockham was writing in Bavaria, the world around him was changing. The 14th century was not only an era of intellectual conflict, it was an era of crisis. Europe faced famines, political instability, and looming ahead, the Black Death. Ockham died in 1347, the very year the plague began spreading through Europe with catastrophic force. Whether he died directly from plague or from other causes is debated, but the timing is chilling. The medieval world he had known was about to be devastated on a scale no philosopher's argument could contain. And yet, even as that world shook, Ockham's ideas kept traveling. To see why, we need to look at the intellectual landscape he was cutting into. Scholasticism, at its highest form, was a brilliant attempt to build a coherent universe of thought. It could feel like a cathedral made of concepts, with arches of logic, pillars of metaphysics, and stained glass windows of theological symbolism. Some thinkers loved that cathedral. They felt it honored God by honoring reason. Other thinkers began to feel the cathedral had become too heavy. It risked becoming a substitute for faith rather than a servant to faith. Ockham was in the second camp. He did not want to destroy the cathedral for the pleasure of destruction. He wanted to remove additions that were not necessary to support the roof. He feared that too many speculative entities made theology vulnerable. If your theology depends on a complicated philosophical claim, and that claim is later rejected, then theology itself can appear threatened. Better, Ockham thought, to ground theology in revelation and in the simplest adequate framework. That instinct influenced later medieval debates about the relationship between faith and reason. It also influenced later political debates about the relationship between spiritual authority and temporal governance. Because once you learn to question unnecessary metaphysical additions, you also learn to question unnecessary political additions. If a pope claims power that is not grounded in scripture or the early church, you can ask, is that claim necessary? Or is it a later addition designed to increase control? This is why Ockham's political writings matter. They turn philosophical caution into institutional critique. And now we can return to the question we posed earlier. What does a philosopher do when his ideas collide with power? Ockham's answer was not to become quiet. It was to become sharper. There is a famous line associated with him, sometimes paraphrased like, "I appeal from the Pope to Christ." Whether the exact wording is perfectly authentic or not, the sentiment matches his stance. He believed ultimate authority belongs to Christ and to truth, not to any office holder who might be corrupted. That stance placed him in a long tradition of Christian dissent, but it also placed him in danger. The line between theological critique and political rebellion was thin, and in the medieval world, rebellion was not treated gently. So why wasn't Ockham executed? Partly because he had imperial protection, partly because medieval politics often constrained the papacy's reach. Excommunication was powerful, but it did not always translate into immediate physical arrest if the person was sheltered by strong rulers. The papacy could condemn, it could delegitimize, it could pressure allies, but it could not always seize. Ockham used that space to write. He wrote to defend Franciscan poverty. He wrote to expose what he saw as papal overreach. He wrote to build an intellectual foundation for resistance that could be defended in court and debated among scholars. He wrote with the urgency of a man who knew that a weak argument could cost lives. And yet, even in political writing, his philosophical instincts remained. He analyzed words carefully. He defined terms. He asked what follows from a claim. He tried to avoid adding assumptions. He cut and cut and cut until the argument stood on what he believed were necessary foundations. This is why later thinkers found him useful. His method could be applied in many contexts. In science, in philosophy, in law, in politics. The razor became a habit. Now, before we finish, we should speak honestly about what Ockham did not do. He did not invent the desire for simplicity. Many thinkers before him valued economy and clarity. He did not single-handedly end scholasticism. Scholasticism evolved, fractured, and continued in different forms long after him. He did not create democracy. Medieval political thought was still far from modern democracy. What he did do was sharpen a particular style of thinking at a critical moment. He gave future thinkers a powerful reason to be cautious about metaphysical excess. And he gave political critics a powerful reason to challenge absolute claims of institutional authority. In that sense, he is a hinge figure. One foot in the medieval cathedral, one foot stepping toward a more cautious, more language-aware, more institution-skeptical style of thought. If you want to feel the human side of this, imagine Ockham as a man in exile, hearing rumors from Avignon, hearing declarations from the papacy, knowing he is condemned, and yet waking every day to write. In a world where parchment is precious and writing is slow, he keeps producing arguments. He keeps turning his mind into a weapon. Not because he enjoys fighting, but because he believes the fight is about truth and the integrity of Christian life. He is not a romantic rebel. He is a friar trained in discipline. His rebellion is structured, it is argued. It is footnoted in the style of his era, even when the tone is fierce. And then finally, after years of controversy, after years of exile, his life ends as the plague approaches. It's a quiet ending compared to the drama of his conflict with the Pope. No battlefield, no martyr's fire, just the end of a human life in a century that would soon lose millions. But the mind does not end there, because centuries later, students and scientists and skeptics and theologians keep invoking his razor, often without knowing the man behind it. They use it to solve puzzles. They use it to argue about theories. They use it to criticize superstition. They use it to demand clarity, and sometimes they use it in the same spirit Ockham used it, as a defense against overconfident systems that claim more than they can justify. That is the real legacy. William of Ockham reminds us that complicated does not automatically mean deep. He reminds us that a system can become a trap if it demands you believe in invisible extras just to keep it elegant. He reminds us that authority, even sacred authority, can drift into overreach. And he reminds us that sometimes the most radical act is not to build a new tower, but to remove what was never necessary in the first place. In an age that loved grand explanations, he insisted on intellectual restraint. In an age that loved expanding institutional power, he insisted on limits. And in an age when disagreement could ruin you, he chose to keep speaking anyway. That is why his name still cuts through time. Not because the razor is a slogan, but because the razor is a habit of truth. But if we stop there, we miss the most interesting part of Ockham's story, because the razor is not only a method, it is the surface of a deeper worldview about how human beings know anything at all. Ockham lived in an age that loved certainty. Medieval universities were built on the idea that you could reach firm conclusions through careful reasoning. The scholastics did not debate for entertainment. They debated because they believed truth could be organized, defended, and taught with clarity. Many of them believed that, with the right philosophical tools, you could show how the world must be. Ockham did not reject this confidence completely, but he tightened the leash. He insisted that the mind has limits, and that much of what people treated as necessary was actually optional decoration. So how did he think knowledge works? One of Ockham's key moves is to treat the world as made up of individuals, and to treat many of our general concepts as mental tools rather than independent realities. That sounds simple, but it rearranges the entire intellectual landscape. Because once you start with individuals, you have to explain how the mind forms general ideas, without assuming that there is a separate, universal thing out there that the mind grasps. Ockham's answer leans heavily on cognition. He distinguishes between the way we directly encounter things and the way we later think about them. He argues that the mind can have an immediate kind of awareness of an individual object, and from that awareness, the mind can form concepts that apply to many similar individuals. This is where the medieval vocabulary can get heavy, so let's keep it human. Think of a child seeing a dog for the first time. The child doesn't need to grasp an invisible entity called dogness, floating somewhere in reality. The child sees this dog, then another, then another. Over time, the child's mind builds a concept that groups those animals together. The concept is real as a mental act, but it doesn't require a separate universal object existing outside the mind. For Ockham, this kind of explanation is not only simpler, it is safer. It keeps us from making claims about invisible structures in the world when what we really have is a pattern in our thinking. That safer instinct shows up again and again in his work. He wants to respect what is given and avoid pretending we have access to metaphysical blueprints. This leads to something that can sound modern: Ockham's attention to language. The medieval world was intensely aware that words can mislead, but Ockham pushed this awareness further. He treated much of philosophy as an investigation into how language and concepts function. If you misunderstand the grammar of your thought, you can invent problems that are not real and then build a whole system to solve them. So he asked questions like, when we say humanity, what exactly are we referring to? Is it a thing, or is it a way of talking about many humans at once? When we say whiteness, is there a separate object called whiteness, or are we describing how white things appear? When we say justice, are we naming an entity, or are we summarizing patterns of action and judgment? If you think these questions are too abstract, Remember that in medieval theology and philosophy, these questions mattered because they shaped how people talked about God, grace, sin, and salvation. A tiny error in a conceptual framework could have massive theological consequences. Occam's razor is therefore a moral discipline as well as an intellectual one. It warns you not to build theological castles out of ambiguous words. Now, there is a second deep element in Occam's thought that often gets overlooked: his emphasis on God's freedom. Many medieval thinkers, following Aristotle, were tempted to describe the world as a necessary structure. If God is rational, then God must act according to the rational necessities we can deduce. Occam resisted that. He believed God is not bound by our logic in that way. This doesn't mean God is irrational. It means God is not imprisoned by human categories. If God chooses to act in a certain way, that becomes the fact. We can study patterns in creation, but we cannot assume that those patterns are metaphysically necessary in a way that forces God's hand. This emphasis leads to what people later call voluntarism, the idea that divine will has a strong role in explaining moral and metaphysical order. Some of Occam's critics feared that this made morality arbitrary, as if God could declare anything good. Occam did not intend a world of chaos. He intended a world where God's sovereignty is real, and where human beings should not pretend to have full access to God's internal reasons. In practice, Occam's position pushes you toward humility. It says, you can know certain things clearly. You can also know that you do not know everything. That humility was not popular with everyone. Some scholars love the grand systems because those systems made the world feel stable and complete. Occam's pruning could make the world feel less architecturally certain. It left more room for contingency, for this is how it is because God wills it, rather than this must be so because metaphysics demands it. But again, remember his context. Occam watched authorities claim certainty while doing politics with spiritual language. He watched grand structures be used as tools of control. Humility about what can be proven becomes, in that context, a kind of resistance. Now we can return to the poverty controversy because it reveals Occam's style in action, and it also reveals why he became dangerous. The Franciscan order was founded on poverty, but the church had to manage practical realities. If thousands of friars own nothing personally, how do they eat? Where do they sleep? How do they study? Who owns the buildings they use? Who owns the books? To solve this, earlier popes had created legal arrangements where the papacy technically held property on behalf of the Franciscans. The friars could use items without owning them. This preserved the symbolism of poverty while allowing the order to function. But in Occam's time, Pope John XXII grew increasingly hostile to the strict poverty interpretation. He challenged the claim that Christ and the apostles owned nothing. He also challenged the idea that the Franciscan arrangement was the best way to interpret Christian perfection. This debate exploded because it was not only about friars. It was about what the church could claim as legitimate. If Christ owned nothing, then poverty is not merely a personal choice. It becomes a central moral sign. And that sign throws a harsh light on a wealthy papal court. So John XXII moved to weaken the strict interpretation. For the Franciscans, who believed poverty was essential, this felt like betrayal. If the Pope could redefine such a central part of Christ's example, what else could be redefined for convenience? Ockham studied John's statements and concluded that the Pope was committing error, not just policy error, but doctrinal error. And this is where Ockham's political logic begins. If a Pope can err, then the Church needs a way to recognize and resist error without collapsing into chaos. Ockham's exile group included major Franciscan figures like Michael of Cesena, the Minister General of the Order. Their alliance with Emperor Louis IV brought together two kinds of opposition to the papacy: spiritual opposition over poverty and political opposition over imperial authority. The papacy responded with condemnation and excommunication. But condemnation didn't end the debate, it intensified it. Because once a pope excommunicates opponents, those opponents have an even stronger reason to argue that the pope is abusing power. In Bavaria, Occam began producing political works that tackle a question medieval Europe had never fully settled. What is the right balance between spiritual and temporal authority? He did not argue for a modern separation of church and state. His world was not that world. But he did argue that the Pope's power is not unlimited and that temporal rulers have legitimate authority that does not depend on papal permission in every detail. He also argued that the community of believers and councils of the church have roles that can matter when the Pope is in error. Ockham's thought, therefore, belongs to a broader medieval movement of constitutional thinking about authority. The idea is not that authority is evil. The idea is that authority must be bounded, accountable, and oriented toward its proper purpose. And Ockham's style remains consistent. He tests claims by asking, where is the evidence? What follows if we accept this? Is this extension of power necessary, or is it an unnecessary addition? He applies the razor to institutions. Now, this is the part of Ockham's legacy that many people never hear, but it matters, because it shows him not only as a philosopher of simplicity but as a critic of absolutism. Centuries later, when Europeans argue about the limits of kings, the limits of popes, and the rights of communities, Ockham's arguments can be recognized as early sparks in a long fire. He is not the whole fire, but sparks matter. Even within the medieval church, Ockham's thought contributed to later currents that would challenge papal supremacy, especially during times of crisis. And crisis was coming. The 14th and 15th centuries would bring schisms, with rival popes claiming legitimacy. When the church has multiple popes, the idea that the pope is always the final authority becomes practically difficult. People begin to ask whether councils can correct or replace popes. That conciliar impulse grows partly from practical desperation, but it also grows from intellectual foundations laid by thinkers who argued that popes can err. Ockham is one of those thinkers. Now, there is a subtle irony here. Ockham did not set out to weaken the church as a whole. He believed he was defending the faith against corruption and error. But once you argue that central authority can be wrong, you open a door. Later people can walk through that door for reasons you did not intend. Ideas have a habit of traveling. That is why historians often describe Ockham as a transitional figure. He stands at a point where medieval confidence begins to shift toward a more cautious approach to knowledge and a more conditional approach to authority. But transitional does not mean minor. Transitional figures can be enormous because they change the direction of the current. Now, let's talk more clearly about Ockham's razor, because if we're building a long script, we need to make sure you can use this in a voiceover without sounding like a textbook. The razor is often summarized as, the simplest explanation is best. But Ockham's actual principle is closer to this. Do not posit more kinds of things than necessary. Do not multiply entities without necessity. In other words, if you can explain a phenomenon using fewer assumptions, you should prefer that explanation until evidence forces you to add more. This is not anti-complexity, it is anti-unnecessary complexity. A good example is medicine. Sometimes the simplest diagnosis is right, but sometimes a patient has multiple conditions. The razor does not forbid multiple conditions. It forbids assuming multiple conditions when one condition fits the evidence. In Ockham's day, the multiple conditions were often metaphysical. Thinkers would add layers of entities to solve conceptual puzzles. Ockham kept asking whether those layers were needed or whether they were simply habits inherited from older philosophical systems. And because he kept asking, he forced his opponents to justify their assumptions. That is why the razor became famous. It turns the burden of proof around. It says, if you want to add extra beings, extra forms, extra structures, you must show why. This habit later becomes incredibly useful in science, where theories compete. Theories with fewer assumptions can be more powerful, but only if they still explain the evidence. Again, the razor is not a magic wand, it is a discipline. Now Ockham's attention to language also left another long-term legacy, the idea of mental language. He believed that thought has a structure, and that spoken language reflects thought. If you want to analyze reasoning, you must analyze not only words on the page, but the concepts and mental acts behind the words. This move pushes philosophy toward a more detailed analysis of meaning and reference. It also helps explain why later philosophers of language sometimes look back to medieval thinkers with surprise. People imagine the Middle Ages as intellectually dull, but the debates about universals, meaning, and concepts were often extremely sophisticated. Ockham's nominalism, combined with his logic, is part of that sophistication. And now we should address a tension that often appears in discussions of Ockham. Did he lead toward skepticism? Some later readers think so, because if you strip away metaphysical structures, you might feel that reality becomes less knowable in a systematic way. If universals are not real entities, and if God's actions are contingent on divine will, then perhaps human reason cannot deduce much about the world. But Ockham did not become a nihilist. He believed human beings can know many things clearly. We can know individuals, we can form reliable concepts, we can use logic to avoid contradictions. We can also rely on revelation for truths that reason alone cannot reach. His caution is not despair, it is boundary discipline. In fact, boundary discipline can lead to stronger knowledge, not weaker knowledge, because it prevents you from pretending you know what you do not know. Now, let's bring the human story forward again. Because Ockham's life is not only an argument, it is a journey through fear and pressure. Picture him in Avignon, a friar surrounded by the papal court's weight, hearing statements about poverty that he believes distort the gospel. He studies, he compares, he concludes the Pope is wrong. That is already a terrifying thought for a medieval cleric. Then imagine him deciding to flee, knowing that flight itself looks like guilt, knowing that the papacy will label him rebellious, knowing that many doors in Europe will close to him. Then imagine him arriving in Bavaria and seeing that he is now part of a larger political contest. The emperor's court is not a monastery, it is a place where power speaks directly. A place where the church can be discussed like a rival kingdom. Ockham has to adapt. His pen has to become not only a tool of philosophy but a tool of defense. This adaptation is one reason his later writing feels urgent. He is not writing for students who want a grade. He is writing for survival and for legitimacy. He is writing to prevent his side from being crushed as heretical rebels. And here, one of the most striking features of his political thought appears: his willingness to accuse the Pope of heresy if the Pope teaches error. That is a dramatic claim. It flips the hierarchy. It says the highest office holder can become the highest danger if he uses the office wrongly. Ockham believed that church authority is meaningful only if it serves truth. Authority detached from truth becomes tyranny. This is a theme that repeats throughout later European history. You can hear echoes of it in later Protestant arguments. You can hear echoes in political theories about limited government. You can hear echoes in the modern instinct to demand justification from institutions. Ockham did not create the modern world, but he helped sharpen one of its moral instincts: power must justify itself. Now, before we close this long narrative, it's worth addressing why Ockham's story is often told in a simplified way. It's easier to sell him as a one-line principle. Choose the simplest explanation. It's easy, catchy, and useful. But if you stop there, you miss what made him historically dangerous. He wasn't dangerous because he liked simplicity. He was dangerous because simplicity, in his hands, became a critique of inflated authority and inflated metaphysics. He cut away claims that powerful people preferred to keep. So what should we remember when we remember Ockham? Remember that he lived in an age when Christianity was not only belief but governance. The church was a legal system, a political player, and an economic power. To debate poverty was to debate legitimacy. Remember that he was a Franciscan, trained to admire Christ's poverty, and that this admiration made him sensitive to the contradictions of wealth. Remember that he was trained in the university tradition and used its tools with fierce precision. Remember that he came to believe the Pope could err in serious ways, and that the faithful could have a duty to resist. Remember that he turned philosophical caution into institutional critique. And remember that he died at the edge of one of history's great disasters, the plague, while his ideas continued to travel into later centuries. If you want a final image of him, don't imagine a man posing with a slogan. Imagine a friar in a cold room, writing by candlelight. Outside, politics roars. In Rome or Avignon, officials are issuing condemnations. In the emperor's court, alliances shift. In villages, people are hungry. Somewhere, disease is beginning to move through trade routes. And in that chaos, this friar keeps doing something stubborn and strangely hopeful. He keeps insisting that words must mean something, that claims must be justified, and that we should not pretend to know what we cannot support. That insistence is not only philosophy, it is moral courage. Because in a world where authority liked to hide behind mystery, he demanded clarity. In a world where power liked to stretch without limits, he demanded boundaries. And in a world where people often surrendered their judgment to institutions, he reminded them that even institutions must answer to truth. That is William of Ockham. Not a slogan, but a life. Not an easy hero, but a disciplined mind that kept cutting until only the necessary remained. And that is why, when people today reach for the razor in science, in law, or in daily reasoning, they are touching a blade that was sharpened in medieval conflict. They are touching the legacy of a man who learned that sometimes the simplest question is the most dangerous one. Do we really need all of this to explain what we claim to believe? And if we don't, what else might fall when we stop pretending? There is one last misunderstanding that we should clear away, because it changes how you hear his story. Some people think the razor means you should always distrust anything invisible. They take it as an excuse to reject religion, reject ethics, reject anything that cannot be measured. But Ockham would not recognize that as his own method. He did not say, only what you can touch is real. He said, don't invent extra layers when you don't need them. In his own theology, he was willing to affirm mysteries on the basis of revelation. He simply resisted turning those mysteries into elaborate metaphysical structures that pretended to be proven. In other words, he would accept faith as faith and knowledge as knowledge, and he didn't like when people blurred the line to gain authority. That is a surprisingly modern honesty. It's also why his thought can feel like it points in two directions at once. On one side, you can see later scientific habits of mind, careful language, careful assumptions, a preference for economy. On the other side, you can see a deeply medieval piety, reverence for God's freedom, obedience to revelation, and an intense concern about the moral integrity of the church. Ockham sits at the hinge, and when you stand at a hinge, people on both sides will claim you, and people on both sides will blame you. Later Protestants sometimes read Ockham as an early ally, because he challenged papal overreach and emphasized Scripture's priority over institutional claims. Later Catholic thinkers sometimes criticize him as part of an intellectual shift that weakened the confident harmony between reason and theology. Later secular thinkers sometimes treat him as a step towards skepticism because his trimming of metaphysics can make the world feel less guaranteed by philosophical necessity. Each of those readings catches a slice, but none captures the whole. The whole is a man responding to the pressures of his time with the tools he had. And to appreciate that whole, it helps to remember the medieval reality of authority. In Ockham's Europe, most people would never read a theological treatise. They lived in villages, they worked the land, they paid taxes, they prayed, they feared war and famine. For them, the church was not an abstract institution. It was the center of life. Baptisms, funerals, confession, festivals, law courts, and local order. So when a conflict erupted over poverty and papal authority, it wasn't just a debate among scholars. It could shape how ordinary people trusted the church. It could shape whether rulers felt morally bound to obey papal commands. It could shape whether a king felt justified in resisting. It could shape whether reform movements gained momentum. That is why Ockham's writings mattered even beyond universities. When he argued that a pope can err, he didn't only challenge a theory, he weakened the psychological wall that made people feel the pope's word was always final. Once that wall cracks, Europe's political and religious landscape becomes more unstable, but also more open to change. You see that openness later in the conciliar movements, when councils claim authority to correct popes during times of schism. You see it later when reformers argue that Scripture must judge institutions. You see it later when political thinkers argue that rulers should be limited by law and by the good of the community. Again, Ockham is not the only cause, but he is a clear contributor, and the irony is that he contributed through discipline, not through chaos. He wasn't trying to ignite a revolution. He was trying to prevent error and overreach. Yet history often turns prevention into revolution anyway, because once you say there are limits, other people start asking, then why not limit more? That is the unpredictable power of a carefully argued idea. So if you ever hear Ockham's razor used as a casual slogan, remember the real origin. It was born in debates where a wrong move could cost everything. It was sharpened in a life where authority condemned him and where he had to defend truth with precision. It was carried forward by generations who found that the habit of trimming assumptions is useful not only in metaphysics, but in politics and in daily reasoning. And that brings us to the simplest way to honor his story, not by repeating his name as a shortcut, but by practicing the courage he practiced. The courage to ask whether a complicated structure is truly necessary, the courage to separate what we know from what we merely assume, and the courage to say that even the most powerful institutions must answer to truth. That is a legacy worth keeping.
Tonight's story comes to an end here, but the past never truly goes silent. It lingers like a candle's last glow, whispering its warnings, its wonders, and its unanswered questions into the present. If this journey moved you, leave a like, subscribe to Ancient Luminaries, and tell me in the comments